16 stops of dynamic range. No, wait. 16 plus stops of dynamic range. Red cameras offer 16 plus stops of dynamic range. Every single camera, regardless of brand, they have their own breaking point. With all these crazy new camera announcements from Canon, Blackmagic with a 12K B-RAW camera, Sony, the a7S III, and every other camera that is dropping into the market, I thought that this would be the perfect time to drop this video. So today we're going to take a look at dynamic range, overexposure, and highlight recovery. And we're going to do that by overexposing RED 8K RAW, so R3D files, red code RAW, from my RED 8K Helium. And we're going to find its breaking point. What we're doing here is building a community of filmmakers, content creators, and creative professionals from all different backgrounds where we can, have a place to meet, share content, share ideas, share experience so that we can all level up together. If you're into that type of thing, please subscribe and remember to enable notifications so that you know every time we drop a new video. So as we get going here, what I'm hoping the takeaways from this video are that you understand that shooting in RAW is not a get out of jail free card. It's not a way to get sloppy with your exposure. And the second takeaway I would say is that understanding your equipment, your capabilities, maybe some of the limitations actually allow you to make better decisions when you're on set. So I'm using a RED camera for this test because RED cameras have clout, right? They've always pushed resolution. They were the first to come out with a 4K camera that most of us could afford, 5K, 6K, pushed it into 8K, and now Blackmagic just dropped that 12K Ursa Mini Pro. But in my opinion, more than just Ks, dynamic range actually makes the bigger impact when you're on set or you're working on a creative project. Most hybrid cameras have roughly 12.5 stops of usable dynamic range, regardless of what the manufacturer says. RED cameras are advertised as having 16.5 or more stops of dynamic range. And now Blackmagic with this 12K camera, they're saying it has 14 stops of dynamic range because people like you and I are not shooting projects in a lab-controlled environment. So these lab numbers generally don't really apply. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a link to the Wikipedia page that talks about full f-stops in case you want to learn more about this whole exposure and dynamic range thing. So to be clear, we are going to be taking a look at full f-stops in this video. Our base f-stop or starting point for this video will be f1.4. And what we'll do is we'll move up in f-stops from there. And just to put something into perspective, if we're talking about 16 full stops of dynamic range, we would be looking at going from f1.4 all the way up to f256. You heard me correct. f256. The difference between f1.4 and f256 is 16 full stops. That is a huge range. I mean, think about what is the smallest aperture that you can go on any lens that you own. For me, it's f22. Before anyone gets too excited, let's get one thing straight. RED does not say they have 16 plus stops of dynamic range in the highlights. RED, like most camera companies, they use middle gray to evaluate how many stops above middle gray and how many stops below middle gray their cameras or their sensors are able to capture. And that is how they measure their total dynamic range. So now let's move on and take a look at a practical example in an interview type of setup using my RED 8K Helium as an example. This, of course, is going to help us judge the overall dynamic range and latitude when it comes to recovering highlights, which is really important if you happen to work with people. Okay, so we're looking at the base exposure. I metered at the top of her forehead on the key side, which, as you know, foreheads and cheekbones, they just tend to clip first. And because this is an interview setup, we care about skin tones and texture. In this first clip, we are at f1.4, and the image looks great. Great texture, great color, great tonality, and it is noise-free, which is a huge plus when you're capturing in RAW. And once we overexpose by one full stop, we end up at f2. And here, you're going to likely notice that there is what appears to be a tone shift. At first glance, you may think the white balance changed, but in fact, it is luminance. The luminance change in the background was caused by the light fall off, giving us the impression that there was a tone shift of some sort. Her skin tone and texture is spot on, and they match exactly to what my eyes could see. And of course, we don't have any issues with the highlights at this point. At 2 stops overexposed, we continue to see the luminance shift and a noticeable reduction in contrast. Her skin looks brighter, but we still have the tonality and the texture. As you know, skin is highly reflective, so it is normal that her skin looks brighter as the light intensity has increased. Once we hit 3 stops overexposed, we begin to see an increase in contrast, and that's because we're trying to recover that image. And that extra contrast actually helped us maintain the tonality and the texture in her skin tones. And the good news is, I don't see any color shift, which is always good. Once we step into 4 stops of overexposure, we see the first definitive color shift. Her skin tones became considerably warmer. It is a pleasing look, but we start to see that reducing the contrast to recover the image saturates the color. All in all though, the fact that we can recover skin tonality and texture without having it look like video or give us a plastic look is very impressive. At f8, 5 stops over, we can see exactly where I was metering. And yes, we have problems. Working with raw controls to try and change the ISO, bring back the blown out highlights, and recover the image resulted in what you're seeing here. There simply is no way to recover 5 stops of overexposure if you're capturing in red code RAW. Pushing beyond that to f11, it accentuates the issues. It is completely unusable, and it didn't matter that I was capturing in RAW and have all the awesome tools that come with RAW controls. As you may remember, in the beginning of the video, I mentioned 16 plus stops of dynamic range. I explained that 16 stops of dynamic range would allow us to go from f1.4 all the way to f256. Let that sink in for just a moment. f1.4 all the way to f256. So the next time you see a YouTube video or a product announcement or some other promotional piece, don't get caught up in the hype. Rather, consider what types of projects you're working on. Rent before you buy, and then choose the right tool for your job. I really hope you guys found this information useful. If you did, be sure to let me know. And until next time, I'm Carlos, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Take care.